How does the economic machine work in today's conditions? When we think about the economy, the first things that come to mind are money, debt, interest rates, exchange rates, or the stock market. Therefore, we often perceive the economy as a system that can only be understood by people working in the field of economics. However, this is a big mistake. Once we remove the unnecessary perceptions in front of our eyes, we realize that the system works with a much simpler logic than we think. Today, people make many financial decisions. For example, grocery shopping, buying clothes, investing, or taking out a loan. When these seemingly insignificant actions come together, they create the economic system. The best way to understand this system is to see it like the human body. The organs of the human body are constantly moving. Sometimes they speed up and sometimes they slow down. However, the principles that determine their movement have remained largely the same for many years. Three main factors determine the long-term direction of the economy: productivity growth, the short-term debt cycle, and the long-term debt cycle. In recent years, new tools have been added to this system. Artificial intelligence has begun transforming production processes. Public debt increased after the pandemic. Digital financial applications made borrowing easier, and the balance of global trade has changed. As a result, today it is not enough to understand only the basic structure. It is also important to understand how to apply it in real life. The starting point of the economy: transactions. To understand the economy, we must first go to its deepest level: transactions. In fact, every financial action a person takes is a transaction. The moment you purchased a product or service using cash, a bank card, a credit card, or digital payment methods, a new ripple is created within the economic system. Imagine buying a cup of coffee from a cafe. You are not the only one who benefits. The cafe earns income. The employees earn income. The supplier delivering products to the cafe earns income. And the government collects revenue. The system works like a cycle. This is exactly how the foundation of the economy works. One person's spending becomes another person's income. When total spending in the market increases, demand rises. If production does not increase at the same pace, prices begin to rise. Therefore, the starting point of many developments in the economy is the millions of transactions people make every day. Why is credit so important in the economy? In today's economy, not only money, but also the credit system plays a major role. Credit gives you the right to use your future income today. For example, you can buy a house with a mortgage even if you cannot afford to pay for it in cash today. This not only brings your spending forward, but also creates additional activity in the economy. At first glance, this seems beneficial for everyone. People meet their needs earlier, companies earn profits, and markets become more active. However, these actions also have consequences. A portion of your future income will now be allocated to debt repayments. This is where economic cycles begin. During periods when credit usage increases rapidly, spending rises, the economy expands, and temporary prosperity is experienced. However, when debt begins to grow faster than income, the opposite process may occur. Borrowing in the digital age. In the past, applying for a loan meant spending a long time at the bank. Today, digital applications allow us to complete the process in a very short time. Buy now, pay later systems, online lending platforms, digital wallets, and various financing models have made borrowing much easier than before. As a result of these developments, economic activity increases, but they also create conditions for debt to grow more rapidly. Therefore, in today's economy, credit is not only an important tool that supports growth, but also one of the main risks that must be managed carefully. Is productivity really the source of prosperity? Debt may temporarily save an economy. However, in the long run, the real factor that makes a country wealthier is productivity. Because if you produce, you survive in this system. When better education, advanced technology, new production methods, and innovation enable more value to be created with the same resources, productivity increases. As a result, living standards improve. Today, artificial intelligence, automation, and robotics have taken productivity growth to a much higher level than in previous periods. However, this development also brings an important question. As production capacity increases, will the resulting wealth be shared across society, or will it become concentrated among certain companies and capital owners? The answer to this question will be one of the most important factors determining how economic growth affects individuals in the coming years. The short-term debt cycle. The economy does not always move at the same speed. Sometimes it accelerates and sometimes it slows down. When access to credit is easy, people naturally want to spend more, companies invest, and economic growth accelerates. However, when demand exceeds production, prices begin to rise and inflation emerges. To control inflation, central banks increase interest rates. As interest rates rise, borrowing becomes more expensive, spending declines, and economic growth slows down. In some cases, this process can even lead to a recession. When interest rates fall again, a new expansion period begins and the cycle starts over. Why was the economy different? After 2020. After the pandemic, the world entered a period of transformation. Massive government stimulus packages, disruptions in global supply chains, and geopolitical developments pushed inflation to levels not seen for many years. As a result, many central banks rapidly raised interest rates, and the global economy entered a search for a new balance. The pandemic did not only affect the healthcare sector, it also had a powerful impact on the global economy. As economic activity nearly came to a halt, many governments provided large support packages to citizens and businesses. At the same time, disruptions in production and logistics networks, rising energy costs, and international tensions caused prices to increase rapidly. As a result, the era of low interest rates that we had become accustomed to came to an end. Central banks began raising policy rates one after another in order to control inflation, entering a much tighter monetary policy period. Today, the global economy is moving under the influence of two powerful forces. On one hand, there is the burden of high interest rates and debt. On the other hand, there is the potential of artificial intelligence and new technologies to increase productivity. In the coming years, we will see how these two forces shape economic growth. How does the long-term debt cycle begin? Short-term economic cycles may be completed within a few years. However, when borrowing continues for many years, a much larger process emerges. As the economy grows, people, companies, and governments borrow more. At first, these debts seem manageable because incomes are also increasing. But over time, when debt grows faster than income, the system gradually becomes weaker and crises begin. After a certain point, even lowering interest rates may not be enough to stimulate the economy. This is because the debt level itself becomes a factor that slows growth. Economists generally call this process deleveraging. Is it possible to reduce or eliminate debt? Throughout history, countries have used different methods to reduce heavy debt burdens. The first method is reducing public and private sector spending. This may slow debt growth, but it can also weaken economic activity. The second method is restructuring debts, or writing off part of them. In this way, the repayment pressure on borrowers is reduced. The third option is rebalancing income distribution through tax policies and social transfers. The final method is for central banks to increase the money supply and provide additional liquidity to the system. This approach can support the economy, but if not managed properly, it may create new inflationary pressures. Most countries use several of these methods together rather than relying on just one. The most discussed problem today. In the past, during financial crises, attention was mainly focused on the debts of banks in the private sector. Today, however, many economists believe that the main risk has shifted to government debt. Due to increased public spending after the pandemic, many countries reached historically high debt levels. At the same time, higher interest rates increased the cost of financing this debt. As a result, governments face a difficult balancing act. On one side is the need to support economic growth through spending, while on the other side is the necessity of keeping rising debt under control. Can a balanced path be created? There is no single solution to overcoming debt crises. The common feature of successful examples is reducing debt over time without severely shrinking the economy. For this to happen, economic growth must not come to a complete stop. Inflation must remain under control, and income growth must exceed debt costs over the long term. Achieving this balance is not easy and is considered one of the greatest challenges of economic management. What we need to know to understand the logic of the economy. There are three main conclusions we should draw from this economic system. First, debt is a useful tool, but when it grows faster than income, it can become a serious risk. Second, the true source of lasting prosperity is not continuous borrowing, but productivity growth. Education, technology, and productivity are the strongest foundations of the economy in the long run. Third, individuals, companies, and countries that can adapt to changing economic conditions are better able to overcome periods of uncertainty. Conclusion. Although the economy may seem complicated from the outside, we can understand it by putting together its fundamental pieces. Think of the economy like a jigsaw puzzle. When all the pieces come together, the full picture appears. But if one piece is missing, the picture is incomplete. In the same way, a person who understands the fundamentals of economics will eventually understand how the whole system works.